In this session, I've talked about the positive aspects of trade in foreign policy. But there's also a negative application, the imposition of economic sanctions on a country if it behaves badly. As U.S. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke once said, economic sanctions are the policy option that falls somewhere between empty rhetoric on the one hand and going to war on the other. Sanctions are more than mere words, but less than military action. Now, economic sanctions don't apply to all conflict situations. They wouldn't work against terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda because they don't have formal institutional or economic systems that can be targeted and weakened through sanctions. But sanctions are an option when a nation violates international norms or threatens the security of others. A case in point is the sanctions that the United States and its European allies recently levied on Russia in response to its takeover of the Crimea, which is part of the Ukraine, and for supporting Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. The sanctions included freezes on the financial assets of wealthy Russians with close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. In recent years, North Korea and Iran have also been targeted with economic sanctions in an attempt to get them to halt their nuclear weapons programs. Now, do sanctions work? Do they get a targeted nation to change its behavior? The answer appears to be only sometimes. Sanctions can clearly hurt a nation's economy. After sanctions were imposed on Russia, the value of its currency, the ruble, fell sharply, as did its stock market, while its economic growth turned negative. Sanctions can also hurt a targeted nation's people. During the more than 2 decades North Korea has been under U.S. sanctions, its poverty rate has risen sharply, and its life expectancy level has fallen. But do sanctions get nations to change their behavior? Studies by David Lexian and others indicate that though sanctions occasionally succeed, they usually don't. A case in point is Cuba. The United States imposed sanctions on Cuba in 1960 following its nationalization of American-owned firms on the island. U.S. companies were barred from doing business with Cuba, and travel to and from Cuba was restricted. The sanctions did not get Cuba to alter its policies, and in 2014, President Obama moved to restore relations with Cuba. Said Obama, "These 50 years have shown that isolation has not worked." Now, why are sanctions ineffective in most cases? Well, one reason is that top leaders of a targeted country rarely suffer personal hardship from the sanctions. They can also turn the sanctions to their political advantage. Putin's popularity rose after he told Russians that the United States was trying through sanctions to destroy Russia. The effect of sanctions can also be undercut by the actions of other countries. When the United States and its Western allies imposed sanctions on Iran, China increased its trade with Iran. Then, too, economic sanctions can fail because they're not strong enough. Sanctioning nations typically stop short of imposing measures that will hurt themselves as well. The Russian sanctions, for example, did not shut the Russian economy off from the international banking system. That action would have hurt European countries that depend on Russia for trade and for its natural gas and oil. Despite such limitations, sanctions have become the preferred alternative to war as an instrument of foreign policy. As Jeremy Greenstock, former British ambassador to the United Nations, noted, military action is increasingly unpopular and in many ways ineffective, and words alone don't work. So something in between these is necessary. What else is there besides sanctions?